You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good, good. You know what I was reflecting on, Jeff?
Oh,
As
boy.
usual, I was reflecting on something. And it's that we sit on so many calls together, I start to pick up all of your things that you stick to, right? That you say over and over again. I'm sure you get the same from me. But one lately has been about best practices, right? And we've kind of gotten almost like bashful about using the term best practices. But I've been thinking about that, and I really feel like, how we ought to use the term going forward is if you're implementing a product, the best practices are the practices built into the product. Not necessarily that they are the best practices from, they perform the best or there's no better way to do it, but that it's definitely going to cost you the least amount of money to configure if you stick to the out-of-the-box process versus customizing it or making it a whacked out integrated process. So that's what I propose. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes up top of mind, right? We're always talking with folks, and they're always asking, well, what is best practice for this? And okay, well, there really isn't like a universal best practice. There are foundational concepts, right? Should you be using MFA? Yes. Would that be considered best practice? Yeah, probably, right? But yeah, I think best practice sometimes is also counter to the organization and them being able to change their business processes to match the best practice. So then it becomes sort of this hybrid. But yeah, it's funny how these things kind of go in waves, and we have terminology. It's like, okay, best practice is kind of like the hot thing. Zero trust is the hot thing. Whatever that wave is, it seems like it comes in bunches.
Exactly. Yeah, zero trust means a lot of things to a lot of people. And fortunately, we have a guest on today who thinks a lot about that and has a lot of reflections he'll share with us today.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we're definitely going to talk about zero trust. So that's going to kind of be the main topic for today. And to help us with the conversation, we've got Sami Laine. He's the Director of Technology Strategy at Okta. Welcome to the show, Sami.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So, definitely want to pick your brain around zero trust and some of the concepts that we keep hearing out there, and maybe work through some things that folks can take away if they want to get started on their journey. But as is tradition around here, the first time you come on the show, we want to find out more about your identity journey, your personal journey. What is your origin story, right, when it comes to kind of being in this space? How did you get into IAM? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Yeah, it was actually neither of the above in a way, because I got into the IAM because I spent my whole career in the security. And I was always on the vendor land side, doing a decade almost at RSA on the fraud and risk intelligence, and then spending another few years at the cloud workload security side. And I saw this fundamental shift where all of the users and all of the data escaped the perimeter. And I started to realize when I had a conversation with a friend of mine that the traditional controls that I had been spending a decade and a half defining and defending with were kind of slipping away. And all that you have left is basically users going to resources that more often than not are in the cloud, both of them. The user is coming from a random device on their random network, going to a cloud service somewhere else. And the traditional perimeter that we spent so much time defining and defending and monitoring and assessing is gone. So it basically came to me in a revelation at a lunch with a friend who basically said, the identity is the new perimeter. All you have left is auth and auth, and all of the traditional security controls kind of get turned upside down. So I came into identity not by coming into identity. It's just that security shifted around me, and I found myself at a core identity company building out the security landscape, at that company. So that's how I came to identity myself.
And that company, Okta, referred you to us as their zero trust guru. And so as we kind of talked about in the beginning of the podcast, you obviously have some perspective on zero trust. So I just wanted to ask, what is zero trust in your words, and what are the major building blocks of zero trust?
Yeah, it really boils down to the basic idea that the traditional perimeter is dead. If you go back and peel back on the term, it was popularized, of course, by an analyst at Forrester 8 years ago, but it really goes much further back than the John Kindervag's white paper on it. It goes back to the Jericho Forum Open Group commandments, where they asserted that auth N and auth C must exchange outside your area of control. And that white paper was written, I don't know, 14 years ago. And it really is the foundational idea that you can't just defend your own turf. You can't just assess users based on their network that they're coming from. You can't just assess any connection coming to your system by assuming that the trust is rooted in the network. Instead, you need to move to a data and identity centric security model. And if you look at the zero trust extended ecosystem from Forrester or Carta with Gartner or the NIST standard, it really all have the same. They all have the same building blocks, but they really boil down to that basic idea that it's not a product, it's not a vendor, it's not a technique, it's a change in philosophy. You need to start assessing things on their own merits, if you will. You need to look at the full context of every single connection or access request. And the full context is everything that you can gain out of that. And it goes beyond, hey, did you know the credential or not? Um, it is, are you on my network or not? It is, what am I recognizing you behaving the same way? Are you coming from the same device in the same context? What are you doing in my system? All of that becomes that rich context. So in that sense, you could say you could start employing zero trust from vastly different viewpoints. You can look at your network and microsegmentation of workloads, or you can say, I need to have a source of truth for my identities before I can do anything. And they're both equally right. And that's why it's been such a weird term, because every single analyst and vendor has glommed onto it because that's what gets the clicks, right? And at the heart of it, though, you can have certain like foundational principles that you can start measuring, saying, is this helping or hurting me?
That's a really good summary, and I think of it very much in the same way. It's really just it's a mind shift of if you were in IT 15, 20 years ago, it was about having that crunchy shell, keeping the bad guys out, which didn't recognize the fact that sometimes the bad guys are inside, but it's not even just about that, right? Even if you have complete trust of the people who work for you and sit at a desk in your office building, it's about the fact that someone could get into your network by 50 other different ways, right? If that shell isn't crunchy enough, or somehow people are able to get in, or they get in via legitimate means, a stolen password or stolen credential, and then change identities within the network, you have, if you don't have any defenses at the resource itself, you're still vulnerable.
Yeah, and it goes like, beyond that to the world that we now live in, where if you think about any company today where you're, managing identities and building infrastructure, um, odds are if you need to start a new service, you're going to first look at a SaaS service. Can I just spin it up and be done in 15 minutes and start using it? If not, you're looking at platform as a service and building it out there. Okay, you need to run your whole stack. Then you're most likely going to stand it up at IaaS, either GCP or AWS or Azure, right? The traditional world where you get a purchase order and rack and stack a bunch of servers and load an operating system on them and then slap some user repository on it, then once you've deployed your software, those days are gone. I mean, you have to have probably a special approval from high up to be allowed to build something in your data center these days, right? So in that sense, you can, you see that most of our users are working remotely, whether they, by force or by choice. Most of our workloads tend to be now outside of our perimeter. So in that sense, the new perimeter is that auth and not C. How do you control access to these resources wherever they are? And that's at the heart of the zero trust. Yeah, you can apply it to your network as well, but you should apply it to every single system that processes or accesses data, and every single user or system or process or an API call that accesses that data.
Yeah, and I think what's really cool about zero trust is that it's not all black and white, right? I mean, if you apply zero trust to a more modern web-based application, you can say, hey, and we want to apply multi-factor authentication to it. But then there are certain, areas of infrastructure or legacy applications where it gets more difficult to apply the modern IAM controls to. Zero trust doesn't, say that it has to be, SAML integration with multi-factor authentication to an application. But at the same time, it doesn't let you off the hook of doing nothing just because, your application's old and maybe only going to be around for a few more years. If it's an area of risk and it's got critical data assets for the organization, it potentially could end up in a data breach or the target of a ransomware attack.
Yeah, this app is going to be around only a few more years. That's what we said in 1999, right? We're still running that app probably somewhere. And Bob, who wrote it, has long since retired, and nobody dares to reboot the server or patch it, because, who knows what's going to happen, right? So yeah, you need to apply that to all of the above. And that's why if you look at like the resource stack, if you look at the resources and the protocols, that's a great lens to look at this through, because yeah, we've solved zero trust for cloud applications. We're using SAML or OIDC. Okta vendors like us solved it years ago. That's not a problem, because you can now have granular access control with the right users getting the right access to the right resource at the right time. All solved. Great. You can add MFA to it. Yes. And then you can add right size MFA to it. And then you can add risk-based MFA to it, where you only authenticate when you really actually need to. So you choose the level of friction as well. Cloud-based apps seems easy. But what about if you have something that uses Kerberos or header-based authentication? The same exact principles apply there too, because it's still an auth and an auth C. So in that sense, when you're looking at your stack and you have a bunch of like web access, right? If you have old school, web access controls that you've applied with TIM and TAM and whatnot, that's a great place to start applying your zero trust too, because if you modernize that access control, you can still use access gateways instead of WAS. And you can then say, I want to put in an access gateway in front of that same app. I don't need to touch the app. I'm authenticating it using the same header-based auth or Kerberos or Radius, for crying out loud, right? Whatever you have as the protocol. That's not important. What's important is that you move that auth and an auth C to that centralized control layer. And that's easy to do today. You can use gateways from vendors like us. You can use gateways from traditional networking vendors like F5 and gateway vendors. There's so many things that you can use for that, because then those layers themselves, they have this rich control plane. So we can integrate straight from the identity source straight to that and say, hey, this user needs access to this particular URI. We'll just validate that they should have access to that URI, authenticate them using the same exact framework we would use for cloud apps. And the user experience is great because they just access the app. If they're in session, they're good to go. There's zero friction. If they need to be stepped up or re-authenticated, we do that. And it's the same experience because it's the same identity, same source of truth, same process. So the look and feel of how the actual security works is going to be uniform, no matter whether it's a legacy on-prem app that you built yourself, a legacy ERP app, from Oracle or whoever, or a cloud-based app. And you can extend it even further and talk about APIs. Like APIs is a huge vulnerability, like we know, right? And you ask any CISO how many APIs you're exposed to, your outside world, and they say a number. Then you interview their team, and the number is 10x. And there you can then say, hey, let's put in some identity-centric controls on those OAuth requests as well. So it goes across the whole stack all the way down to how you access your infrastructure. And you can do the same thing there and say, hey, let's move my DevOps engineer and system administrator access to RDP sessions to the Windows infrastructure and SSH access to Linux infrastructure, and use their identity as the source there too, instead of keys. We can move to short-lived certificates where you mint the cert for access based on zero trust principles And that way, the whole stack from top to bottom shifts. And now you have a single repository of who should access what and a single method where you can do that assessment and add friction when the risk is high and remove friction when the risk is low. So it's great for the users and great for security. It's a win-win-win.
I feel like this is one of the areas why it gets so confusing, I think, for folks who are looking to get in this space is just how involved you need to be across all the different applications. And, I think one of the challenges that we see, or at least that I see, is, you mentioned a few different products, right? Obviously, you're with Okta. There's other vendors that have zero trust somewhere in their marketing materials, right? And maybe they are truly a zero trust product, or maybe they're just trying to glom on to this current zero trust marketing wave, right? And kind of mind share. If I am looking to get into zero trust, or if I'm not sure, what are some of the fundamental properties of a true zero trust product versus something that might not really be in the zero trust space technically, but is trying to maybe, surf that wave of mindshare?
Right. How do you tell if the marketing spray painted it on 15 minutes ago?
Exactly.
You can take a look at some of the properties of any system or process or technology, and there's kind of like three lenses that I like to look at them through. First one is it perimeterless by design? Meaning the architecture of what you're building should assume no perimeter that you apply and check things at. So if the solution that you're looking at requires you to take all of your traffic from your users, whether they're on mobile somewhere and going to a cloud app, and trombone all of that through your data center and through an appliance and trombone it back out again, then that probably isn't a great long-term solution, and it adds brittleness and cost and complexity. So if the architecture of whatever you're looking at, whether it's a vendor's product or a solution that they're building for you, assumes no perimeter and can work in situations where the endpoint or the resource lives in the cloud or in your data center and works equally well, then that's great. That's going to help you. And you can look at everything that you already own through that lens. The second out of three that I like to look at is, does this tool, vendor, product, process, solution add more context? Meaning, does it give me better insight into what is the likelihood that this request is genuine and should be served or not? So, for example, think of something very old school in a way, like an email security gateway. People often don't think about that as a zero trust solution, right? But it can be foundational in that, because if something like Proofpoint can tell you right now that these 7 employees out of your 7,000 are actively being targeted in a phishing attack right now in this 5-minute window, because those attacks are super short-lived, and your identity system is aware of that, then you can shift those users dynamically into a different security group and require them to authenticate, even if they're on a verified machine, managed device, whatever it is, and require them to use something strong that's phishing resistant, like WebAuthn. And that way you can make sure that those users, yes, there may be slightly more friction for their access, but they are protecting dynamically against that particular attack right now. Super rich context. Same thing with things like user behavior analytics. If you look at UBA, they can tell you interesting things. Caspies do a lot of behavior analytics these days. They can tell you interesting things. All those are context that you can do. Same thing, let's say that you have unmanaged devices because it's your partner portal. You don't manage their computers. But what if you could interrogate still and say, what is the endpoint security state of that machine? Is it actually patched or not? Is it running endpoint security on it or not? And there are now tools that allow you to do that. You don't have to manage that device, but you can put a small security product app running on that endpoint that you request to handle the authentication, and you can get some, with the user's consent, some security context, and you can tell what is the likelihood that this product, this endpoint is owned. So those are the kinds of context that you can now add that goes way beyond, hey, did you know the credential or not? And then the last third one is the dynamic access control that I already touched on. Yeah, you have now richer context, but can you make better decisions with it? Can you dynamically change your policies based on the situation you find yourself in. And that could be explicit policies saying, hey, user is under attack, so I'm going to switch them to a security group. Or it can be purely risk-based, where you have a risk engine that's assessing all of this context and then evaluates that. And if the risk is elevated, you step them up for MFA or require a stronger type of factor, authentication factor. Or just let them in without a password because the risk is low, the resource risk is low, there's nothing in the context that raises any flags, so there should be no friction. So those are the three things: perimeter design, context awareness, and dynamic access control. You can look at everything you own through that lens, and it gives you a great sense on, hey, is this going to help me in the long term, or is this going to hurt me in the long term?
You know, I'm glad you mentioned what do you mean let somebody in without a password, right? Or MFA. I think that's part of the risk calculus that gets done to say, do we really care if people are looking at the, company cafeteria menu? Probably not. Who cares, right? For having burgers or hot dogs or whatever it may be. And I think that's an important thing because that plays right into what you were talking about earlier around the usability, right?
Yeah.
If we can provide an environment where you're authenticated when you need to be and only when you need to be, and when you need to be, it is at the appropriate strength, that's a win again for everybody, right? It makes it easier for end users to get in, to get the resources they need. And when there are security issues or potentially threats against a specific identity, that to me has always been the challenge is what do you do with that information, right? It's very much kind of like the old days where everything would go into like a SIM and some poor analyst is looking at this giant log of files. And,
7 days later.
Yeah, exactly. And they're not finding things real time, or they're finding it. I think it's like 180 days is usually the detection of a breach. I'm like, that's 6 months, right? I mean, by that time you're done already. Whatever they wanted to take, they're going to take. So I think having that context and being able to help really pull it forward and make it more that dynamic model where, yeah, let's leverage the tools that we've got. Let's dynamically shift people between up, down, left, right when it comes to authentication. Maybe it makes it easier for them this time. Maybe it makes it harder.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
it's all risk.
Exactly. And if you think about if you, the listener here, are thinking, oh my God, how am I ever going to get anybody in my organization to buy off on this? There's two key things. I mean, one of them is that this can be transformational to the user experience. And we're already under tremendous pressure with COVID, with remote work, with more dynamic teams than ever before in making that user experience less hateful, let's just call it that. Because up until now, IT has been the preventer of information access, right? Especially the security teams. They're like, stare directly into the sun for 5 seconds to access. This is the kind of thing that we can now bring, which is I'm making everybody's life better every day. And you show it to the CEO and say, hey, here's how you log in now. And it's better, more secure than before. And by the way, we're not even asking for your password. You just got yourself an executive sponsor who's going to push this whole thing through right away. So in that sense, we can now give better security with much better user experience. And that's the lever that a lot of the IAM professionals are finding to be key. You find a project that everybody needs, that needs good security, but that also is painful because you're MFAing them to death every day. If you can flip that to that zero trust model, you're managing their device. They already authenticated to the device with a biometric. Why do you need a password? Right. So that's where I am at. I am at there today. I logged in today to my laptop, and I didn't use a password for it. I logged into my corporate portal and looked up the calendar invite for our session here, and there was never a password involved because my company manages my device. It knows the security state of the device. I biometrically authenticated to that device. What else do you need? Asking me a password reduces security. It introduces a vulnerability where I could be now fooled into entering it. But I know I'm not going to be asked that. So therefore, if I see a password prompt, I know it's a phishing attack. So these are the kinds of things that you can move towards, and that increases security, reduces friction, and that's your lever. That's how you can get your company to sign off on that first project. Pick something you can win, and then, find that executive sponsor who really wants that experience, because that positive user experience can often be the lever that makes these projects actually lurch forward all of a sudden.
Amen to that. And that's our quote of the week, Jeff, is having a password actually makes it less secure. I love it.
That's the teaser.
Sami, yeah, that's our teaser. Sami, it sounds to me like you're talking about identity at the center. It's not just zero trust. It's identity at the center, right? That's how we came up with the name for this podcast. Speaking of the security strategy from RIS, the cybersecurity framework, um, how does zero trust and identity at the center relate to that?
Yeah, it's really truly there. I mean, the name of the podcast could not be better. I draw this diagram on a whiteboard where you can't build a zero trust program or project without having identity at the center. And that's because if you don't know who your users are, you can't start solving it because you have to give the right people the right level of access to the right resources in the right context with the right level of friction. And it starts from that right people. If you look at the analysts, they all agree. You need to have a source of truth on who those peoples are. And all of a sudden, it's the IAM guys. They're not just sitting there in the basement, making, new leaves into the nodes of your giant forest of AD servers. They're now at the heart of your cybersecurity strategy. And that's why we see these collaborations very, very quickly form, where you're really talking to the security teams and the app teams, and and saying, "Hey, how do we define this?" And that's where it really comes. And you mentioned that cybersecurity framework from NIST, and that's a great lens because if you think about that, there's kind of like five things in that strategy. You have your traditionally IAM has been in that protect strategy out of the five. The challenge that we face here is that the traditional controls were often used in a silo. The silo was inside that protect strategy. And then if you look at that cybersecurity framework, there's like five elements to it. First is identify, then it's protect, then it's detect, then it's respond, then it's recover. And IAM often was sitting there in the protect strategy. We put a password and MFA and something like that in front of it. But then all the detection was happening in the fancy security tools on the 17th floor, not at the IAM cave, in the sub-basement -2, right? And today, those two things are directly connected because as soon as you make an authentic decision, you should enrich that decision, like I mentioned, with this contextual data. But after that, you also want to, look into what's happening in that session. If you detect a threat, or you detect a breach in progress, or there's an insider attack happening right now that your UBA or SOAR or other tools detect, that should come right back to IAM because that threat actor should not be allowed to open up another session into another resource. That threat actor shouldn't be able to pivot from what they learned to another system. So that's why these things are now bidirectional. It's rich identity data flowing down into the security orchestration tools and SIMs and so forth, and those rich decisions and threats and assessments coming back into the identity world so you can keep continuously assessing the risk of that. And then when you're responding to an attack, then those tools need to have that identity context as well so that you can then recover back from it. So in that sense, identity is now much more connected into these things and not just an LDAP or AD server sitting somewhere on the sidelines.
And I think one of the things that, for folks who are listening, if you look up the NIST.gov cyber framework, right, there's a lot of good information there. And I'll put a link to that in our show notes for people to check that out. But it really kind of spells out really kind of the approach that is recommended. And it's not a step-by-step approach. I think that's the important thing too, right? There's a lot of things that kind of run in parallel and you may be, moving around from the different areas as well. One of the things, Sami, is we, I know we're getting short on time, but I'd like to have some sort of tangible takeaway for people who are listening. What are top suggestions for people if they're looking to start their zero trust journey? Where do they begin? And maybe they've already started and they just don't know it yet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're still like catching up on what this terminology is and what do you actually mean by these terms, I would still go and look at the Beyond Corp paper that Googlers published in 2014 after their nation state attack, where they recognized that, hey, they needed to treat every single asset in their inside network the same way as if it was connected to the public internet. That's a great foundational piece to read even today to understand kind of like how Google went and solved this. Now they did it their way. You don't have to replicate Beyond Corp in your organization, but it's a good like starting point. I would also read the NIST, document that describes this. They have their not only the cybersecurity framework, but they have a zero trust white paper, and that really outlines a lot of this in a really interesting way. It allows you to look at kind of like what are the resource protections that you need, what kind of a policy enforcement point do you need, etc. And then you can map that in your mind better into what your assets are. Now, selfishly, of course, Okta has built things too. So we have a whole maturity model and a zero trust, like an assessment tool that you can use. You can look at your own organizational maturity and systems maturity and say, where do we stand on the identity-centric maturity model on the zero trust journey? And at stage zero, where we all started a few years ago, you basically had fragmented identity where there were passwords everywhere, silos of Active Directories and LDAPs and whatnot, no cloud integration. Today, at stage one, we're mostly there in most organizations where we now have unified at least the IAM. We have a single sign across employees, contractors, and partners. Hopefully, we have modern MFA that not just OTP somewhere, but modern MFA that's dynamic and unifies the policies across the apps and servers. And we're now moving towards stages 2 and 3, where you first add that context, where your access policies are no longer explicit yes, no for this group of employees. Instead, you move to context-based access policies saying, if you're on a known device, you'll be able to access this set of resources without further than single MFA. And then here's where we also see right sizing of the factors. Like, I should expect that my end customer logging into their portal would need maybe less security for that than my CFO or DevOps engineer logging into the wire transfer system, or DevOps engineer logging into my CI/CD server to orchestrate some changes to my production. So I would want a different MFA experience for them with a different level of security. And you want to add that at stage 2. And then last, at stage 3, we really go from that context-based policies where they're still explicitly written out saying, in this context, do this, and you're moving on to that risk-based access where you're just looking at the risk score, and you can start providing that continuous adaptive authentication authorization and remove that friction where you don't need it. Like I live in that dream world where I just, if I have my finger with me when I make it to my desk, I'm good to go. I'm in.
Let's hope your finger stays attached.
As long as my finger stays attached, I'm still good to go.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that report, I'll put a link to it. It's really kind of a neat infographic that Okta has on their website, so I'll have a link to that in the show notes. But I thought it was interesting that it seems like it was some sort of poll, and there's no date on it, so I'm not sure when this was, but let's assume it's relatively recent. Where nearly every organization, 97% polled, has implemented security solutions that map to a modern zero trust strategy, but only 16% have actually defined what their zero trust initiative is. And you talked about several different capabilities there around single sign-on and MFA and policy and provisioning and a bunch of different things. And most organizations, they've got some of that. And I think the challenge is, how do you put it together in a cohesive manner that really kind of steps up the game, but what's the strategy, right? Otherwise, you may be putting in a whole bunch of stuff, and you never realized you were actually on a zero path journey or a zero trust path, journey
Right.
to get things done.
Yeah, sorry for the missing attribution. We started that in 2019 and continued in 2020. The 2021 data is not out yet.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so relatively recent, and I think just as a side note, I was thinking about policies and behavior analysis. So you talked about it earlier. And I got to imagine that behavior analysis looked really, really weird at the start of the early last year when all of a sudden a whole bunch of people were working from remote locations or, their homes. And it's probably going to look weird again in the next, several months as maybe, hopefully economies and businesses start to open up and maybe people go back to work, maybe not. And I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of new baselines for behavior emerge as a result of this COVID shift. So it'll be interesting to watch.
And that's something that we've definitely seen in that our own tools that have the behavioral models, the beauty of it is that it's dynamic, right? So we see you on the same device, but all of a sudden you just come from the same, ISP, for 18 months in a row. And that's the new normal for you. And the system basically will learn that very quickly. And the same thing when you then all of a sudden pop out in Dubai, out of the airplane, first time in 18 months, maybe we MFA you once. But if we see that all the other contexts stayed exactly the same, it is you now in Dubai, then okay, you're good to go. So it learns and adapts to that based on your actual behavior. You don't have to relearn it or reteach it or anything else. That's why it's important to have that ability to have that dynamic access control that adapts to the situation and learns from good outcomes and bad outcomes equally.
Yeah, that's really important. So, all right, I think, what I want to do is probably end on a little bit of a lighter note rather than getting so neck deep here into the identity space.
What? This was light note. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I guess relatively speaking, it would be a light note. But for folks who are listening, they may not be aware, you're from Finland. And Finland was the happiest nation in the 2020 United Nations annual report. And for those scoring at home, the United States was 14th. So Finland was number 1, United States 14th. Why are people in Finland so happy? Is it all the coffee they drink? Is it the saunas? What is it?
I don't know. Maybe it's Finland has the highest consumption of bananas per capita. So I'm not sure if correlation, causation, which way it works here. But all I can assume is that they answered that ironically, since I chose to move to California in the 90s. But I do see it. I think it's it's not only Stockholm syndrome that you're identifying with your captors. I think there's something to it, and I think it's just that like feeling of fairness. Even if you're not doing super great and you're not the richest man in the world, if you feel like you're getting a fair shake, that has a huge impact on happiness. And if you ask my wife, she would say that it doesn't rain enough in California to be happy. So maybe there's something to it. Maybe rain adds happiness.
Especially now. It's definitely, I think, drought territory. My in-laws live in north of San Francisco, so we're constantly on the lookout for fire watches and stuff out there. But Jim, do you have any ideas on why Finns seem to be so happy? Any weird stats maybe that you might know? I didn't know about the banana one, so I'm not sure if that's true or not, Sami.
I didn't know that either. I don't know if Sami's pulling a fast one on us or what. I know that bananas aren't native to Finland. I know that much. Now, I've never been to Finland. Helsinki is definitely on my bucket list. I've heard such great things about it. Sami shared with us offline that he's planning a trip there soon. And I've heard in the summer, the days are super long and people hang out at the cafes and people are very friendly and open. And obviously the converse to that is the winter, the long, dark winter. And Jeff, you mentioned the saunas. I've got to think I've heard that has great health benefits, and I do it sometimes, or, spend a long time in the sauna when it's really cold out. But I've noticed, so I travel at times to South Dakota. In the winter, it's about as cold in South Dakota probably as it is in Finland.
Oh,
and
colder for sure.
Yeah, and the people there seem very happy as well. So there might be some correlation there that, accepting a crazy climate and maybe people being a little bit more spread out, all those things probably help some. I do think that when things are more crowded, people are competing for resources more, and it's kind of, people start to get the attitude of it's me against the rest of the world, and I don't think that makes people happy deep down. So I don't know. There's my philosophical viewpoint.
Or it might be just the cryogenic treatment benefits, of freezing to death, and then when you didn't die, you feel good about it, right?
Your body will be preserved for future generations as they continually find, weird stuff up in the Arctic that, has been around for a while. I think that's my theory. I think heat makes you angry, and this is why Florida Man is such a fabled character. Is the heat and humidity drives you to be absolutely nuts, and when it's cold outside, you don't want to be outside doing nuts. You want to be someplace where it's warm. So I think here's another fact for you that I became aware of recently is the average. So Finland has a very high coffee consumption. I think the average is something like 8 cups of coffee a day. Sami, you've been in the U.S. for a while. Where do you fall in the spectrum? Are you above or below that average number?
Yeah, I might be below the Finns average, but probably above the American average. I try to keep it to only doing one pot a day, but I end up drinking most of it myself for sure. And now that I have high school age kids, I need to probably start amping that up because my coffee keeps getting stolen in the morning. So now that school's out, maybe I'll get the full pot to myself again, and I don't have any interlopers there.
All right, so let's go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Before we do that, any final words of wisdom, Sami, from folks out there who are looking to kind of get started through zero trust, or how they should be looking at things?
All I'm going to say is pick a project that is important and find a sponsor. If you find a sponsor and you make their lives a lot easier every day, through that IAM magic that you can add to that, that's your path to happiness. That's how you get these things, above the line that gets funded and get the resources to do it.
Very good, Jim. How about you? Any final words of wisdom for this week?
I don't know. I think we should spray paint zero trust on the outside of the Identity at the Center podcast.
Yeah, maybe I'll
zero
do
trust certified.
Maybe I'll do like a
now
special
with more
logo
zero
or something.
trust.
Yeah, 100% more zero trust or something like that. Some weird stat that nobody's going to ever fact check or care to. All right, well, let's go ahead and leave it then for this week. Sami, thank you so much for joining us. This is hopefully it was very helpful for me, and hopefully our audience found it as well. Some tangible takeaways, things that they can start thinking about. I think really, this model of authentication and zero trust and really breaking down and making sure that identity is protected wherever it may be is really where we want to be from a security perspective when it comes to identity. So hopefully people are able to take that away. And don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode. We'll have links to that Okta report that we kind of briefly talked about, as well as the NIST cybersecurity framework. And then also, if you want to connect with Sami, we'll have a link to Sami's LinkedIn profile, where people can reference and reach out in case they've got questions and things like that. So with that, we're going to go ahead and leave it for this week. You can find us on the web at identityatthecenter.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And with that, we'll go ahead and leave it. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, Sami, for joining us, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.